Imagine a man whose very presence unsettles decades of silent prejudice. A man whose arrival at a humble diner transforms whispered judgments into a daring invitation for conversation. In the flickering neon glow of a long-forgotten sign, he sits down and challenges every expectation. This is not an explosion of anger. It's a quiet rebellion built on listening, understanding, and the courage to bridge divides. J.D. Vance pulled into the parking lot of Owen's Diner on a cool Springfield night. The establishment, modest and steeped in history, was tucked away in a small corner of Ohio, a place that had seen countless generations pass by. Its neon sign, though flickering and worn by time, cast a soft, reassuring glow over the cracked pavement. For J.D., this diner represented more than a resting spot after a long day of meetings and policy debates. It was a brief escape from the relentless demands of public life. Earlier that day, a local had mentioned Owen's Diner to him, a person who swore by the homemade meatloaf and hand-cut fries. Exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. Every handshake and every round of endless political talk had chipped away at the ideals he once held dear. Tonight, all he wanted was a quiet meal, a moment to simply be. As he parked and stepped out of his car, J.D. inhaled the crisp air mixed with the inviting aroma of grilled burgers and fresh coffee. Each step toward the door was measured and deliberate. The bell above the door jingled softly as he entered, announcing his arrival to a room already saturated with decades of memories. Inside, Owen's Diner was a world unto itself. The worn booths and faded checkered tablecloths spoke of a time when life moved at a gentler pace. Photographs, Polaroids taken over the years, adorned one wall, capturing smiles, tears, and the silent strength of a community. The air was thick with the aroma of sizzling bacon, the savory promise of grease from the grill, and the warm comfort of brewed coffee. For a moment, J.D. allowed himself to be enveloped by the familiarity of it all. Yet, as his eyes adjusted to the low light, he noticed something in the expression of the hostess behind the counter. Her friendly smile faltered when she recognized him, a fleeting hesitation that sent a shiver down his spine. In that split second, he saw uncertainty, even apprehension, etched across her face. Across the room, a few patrons exchanged glances. One man, midway through his burger, leaned in to murmur a comment to his companion. A woman in a well-worn flannel set her coffee cup down a little too forcefully, her eyes narrowing before she quickly looked away. J.D., a seasoned man, no stranger to judgmental stares, felt the weight of their collective expectation. In this unassuming diner, he sensed that he was more than just another customer. The hostess stepped forward and, with a nervous tuck of a loose strand of hair behind her ear, said in a carefully measured tone, "Good evening. Are you dining in or taking out?" J.D., with a small, weary chuckle, replied, "Dining in, if that's all right." A silence followed. A pause too long for such a simple question. The hostess glanced over her shoulder as if seeking silent permission from someone beyond the swinging door of the kitchen. "I need to check something real quick. Just one moment," she said, disappearing behind the door. Standing alone in the muted light of the diner, J.D. felt every eye turn toward him. A man at the counter shifted uneasily in his seat. Someone muttered under their breath. The atmosphere grew heavy with unspoken disapproval. From behind the closed kitchen door, muffled voices rose and fell, a hidden discussion that J.D. could only guess at. Yet he stood calmly, rolling his shoulders back, determined not to make a scene. When the hostess returned, her expression was no longer tentative, but resolute. "I'm sorry, sir," she announced, her voice firm. "We can't serve." Those words struck like a verdict. In that moment, the entire room fell into a dense, expectant silence. It wasn't merely a matter of business, it was personal. J.D. felt the full weight of that rejection in his chest. The usual hum of conversation was replaced by a charged quiet. The sizzling of the grill persisted, a stubborn reminder of life going on, but everything else seemed to pause. J.D. studied the hostess's face carefully. There was no overt hostility, only the chill certainty of a decision made. His eyes drifted past her to the kitchen window, where two cooks worked behind a heat lamp, their faces obscured in the dim glow. Their expressions were unreadable, yet their silence spoke volumes. Clearing his throat, JD asked softly. "I'm sorry. Did I do something wrong?" Without a flicker of movement, the hostess repeated, "It's just, we'd rather not serve you tonight. No policy and we're closing soon. Just that." JD's hands dropped to his hips as he exhaled through his nose. In his years of public life, he'd faced countless uncomfortable moments, fiery debates, pointed interviews. But never had he been turned away from a simple, modest diner. It was a rejection that stung, a judgment that was as much about who he was as what he represented. A soft cough broke the tension. JD turned and caught the gaze of an older man seated near the counter, a man whose blue work jacket bore the scars of decades of labor. The older man shook his head almost imperceptibly before returning to his meal. A few booths away, a woman adjusted her position, her face a mask of reserved indifference, while a younger man, likely in his 30s, leaned back with his arms crossed as if savoring the unfolding drama. In that moment, JD felt the eyes of the diner pin him down. Eyes that looked away in disdain, eyes that lingered with a hint of satisfaction, and eyes that burned with a quiet, determined anger. He had choices. He could walk out, let the media spin a tale of a senator refused service. He could shout, demand an explanation, force the issue, and turn this moment into another headline. But he chose a different path, a path of measured inquiry and calm resolve. "All right," JD said, nodding slowly. "Can I speak with the manager?" A murmur rippled through the room. The hostess hesitated once again, glancing furtively toward the kitchen as if searching for someone to share her burden. The older man mumbled something under his breath. A voice near the window let out a short, incredulous laugh. JD simply stood there, waiting. The hostess slipped out through another door, and after several beats of charged silence, a plate was slid across the counter. Then the door swung open, and a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s stepped out. His thick arms were crossed over a grease-stained apron, and his name tag read, Don. Without preamble, Don said in a gruff tone, "I hear you got a question." His gaze was challenging, a silent dare. JD met Don's stare with an even calmness. "Yeah," he replied. "I'd like to know why you won't serve me." Don exhaled sharply, as if he'd expected this very question. Wiping his hands on his apron, he glanced over at the gathering crowd. "Look," he said slowly, "this isn't." JD arched an eyebrow. "Seems pretty personal," he countered. Don's jaw tightened. He rubbed the back of his neck and finally sighed. "People around here have opinions about you, about what you stand for. I run a business and I don't want any trouble." JD nodded, absorbing every word as if it were a weight pressing upon him. He glanced toward the counter where the older man resumed his meal, his chewing deliberate, as though every bite were measured against years of loss. In a booth nearby, the younger man continued watching, his arms crossed as if in silent judgment. In the charged silence, JD could have left. He could have simply walked out, allowing the media to write the next sensational headline. Instead, he did something unexpected. He pulled out a chair and sat down right there at the counter, letting the weight of his presence sink in. "Then let's talk," he said softly, his voice calm yet determined. A ripple of tension ran through the diner. No one raised their voice. No one slammed chairs or stormed out. Instead, the room held its breath, waiting to see what would come next. Don's eyes narrowed as he studied JD, then slowly, almost reluctantly, he said, "Talk." JD continued, "You say you don't want me here. I get that. But what I don't get is why. Let's talk about it." A low chuckle came from the young man in the booth. "Man, this guy's got nerve," he muttered, shaking his head. But JD paid him no mind. Instead, he focused on Don, who had now pulled a chair close and leaned on it. His apron, dusted with flour from the morning's work, served as a reminder of his daily struggle. "I run a business. Don began, his tone laced with fatigue. I don't pick fights, and I sure don't want headlines, but I've got a community to think about. JD nodded slowly. All right, then tell me, what does this community think about me? Don glanced around as if waiting for an answer from someone else. The hostess by the counter shifted uncomfortably, and the older man kept his eyes down, while the young man in the booth remained silent. Finally, Don said, People here don't like politicians. They don't trust them. And some of the things you've said, the positions you've taken, they don't sit right with folks. Fair enough, JD replied, leaning back slightly. But you don't really know me, do you? Not personally? Not personally, no, admitted Don with a heavy sigh. Then tell me, JD pressed, if I were just some random guy walking into your diner, not someone you'd seen on TV, would we even be having this conversation? For a long moment, silence reigned as the weight of that question hung in the air. Finally, the young man scoffed. This isn't about TV, man. JD turned his attention to the young man. Who am I? He asked with a wry smile. I'm the guy who acts like he understands regular people, yet somehow still ends up playing the same political games as everyone else. The young man faltered for a moment before asking, So, what should you have done differently then? What would make you more genuine? JD's expression softened and he rested his forearms on the table. You already made up your mind about me before I even walked through that door, he said. You wanted me to get mad, to fight back, so that you could feel justified. A tense pause followed. The young man's mouth opened as if to retort, then closed, leaving the silence to speak for itself. Taking a measured breath, JD continued. But what if I told you I know exactly how that frustration feels? Don, you said nothing changes. I grew up feeling left behind. I watched people I cared about get abandoned by promises that were never kept. I did what I had to do, worked hard, and yes, I went to school to do things people never expected me to do. But I've never forgotten where I came from. Don's fingers tapped against the table as he listened. His expression, though still guarded, showed hints of something akin to understanding, a reluctant empathy, perhaps. JD's voice grew softer, more reflective. I'm not here to change your mind tonight, Don. I'm here as a man who, like you, carries the scars of broken promises and lost dreams. I'm here as a customer, not as a politician. I'm just a guy who wants to enjoy a meal without all this hostility. From the counter, the older man in the work jacket muttered, Damn shame when a man can't even get a burger. That small remark, laden with decades of resignation, seemed to crack the tension ever so slightly. A few murmurs of agreement passed through the room. Even Don let out a small, humor-tinged chuckle as he shook his head. Then what now? JD asked, turning back to Don. What do we do with all this anger and disappointment? Don looked toward the kitchen, where the cooks paused in their work, then back at JD. I'll tell you what, he said slowly. You sit here, finish this conversation, and if by the end of it I don't think you're just another guy talking a good game, maybe, just maybe, I'll have Mary bring you a menu. JD nodded, a small, ironic smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Sounds like a deal, he replied quietly. For the first time that night, the atmosphere in Owen's diner began to shift. The tension, once so oppressive, gave way to something resembling cautious dialogue. The young man in the booth, whose earlier derision had been loud and dismissive, now sat up straighter, his eyes reflecting a mix of curiosity and wariness. Even the other customers, who had been silent spectators until then, began to lean in, eager to witness this unexpected conversation. As the night stretched on, the diner transformed from a battleground of judgment to a form of raw, unfiltered exchange. Over steaming cups of coffee and the comforting aroma of home-cooked food, JD and Don began to peel back the layers of misunderstanding that had built up over years. "Tell me," JD said softly, "what exactly do you think people expect from someone like me?" Don paused, his eyes drifting toward the faded photographs on the wall, a timeline of faces that had witnessed countless cycles of hope and disappointment. "They expect promises," he said slowly. "They expect handshakes, big speeches, and then nothing. They see you, with all your credentials, and they think you're just another suit playing the game. They're tired of empty words and hollow assurances." JD's gaze fell for a moment as he remembered the promises he had made and the trust he had struggled to maintain. "I know," he admitted. "I've seen it happen over and over again. People give you a chance, only to be let down. I can't promise that I won't ever disappoint, but I can promise that I'll try my best to listen, to really hear." Across the diner, the conversation between the two men began to resonate with others. An older woman, who had been quietly sipping her tea in a corner booth, leaned forward. "It's not just about the promises," she said softly. "It's about trust. When you walk into a place like this, you want to be seen as more than a headline. You want to be recognized as someone who understands the struggle." A murmur of agreement rose from several tables. Even the young man, whose earlier cynicism had given way to silent contemplation, nodded slowly. Don, his voice now less guarded, continued, "I've spent my entire life serving this community. I've seen neighbors lose their jobs, watched families move away because nothing ever changed. Every time a politician comes in, it's like a reminder of all those broken promises. And tonight, I'm not sure what to believe." JD's eyes softened with empathy. "I can't change the past," he said gently, "but I want to be a part of a future where every voice is heard, where every meal shared is a small step toward building that trust." A long pause ensued, filled only by the ambient sounds of the diner, the clinking of dishes, the low hum of conversation restarting, the soft sighs of a community beginning to question its long-held assumptions. "Maybe," Don finally said, "this conversation is the start of something. Maybe it's not going to fix everything tonight, but it could be a seed for change." JD nodded. "That's all I'm asking for, a chance to grow that seed into something real." The dialogue deepened. Stories were shared, stories of hardship and resilience, of personal loss and small victories. JD recounted memories of his childhood in a small town not unlike Springfield, where every handshake was a promise and every smile carried the weight of unspoken understanding. He spoke of nights spent under endless skies, dreaming of a future where no one was forgotten. His voice wavered at times, revealing the vulnerability behind the public persona. Don listened intently, and as the conversation unfolded, he too began to reveal pieces of his own history. He described long days at the diner, early mornings and late nights spent serving regulars who had become family, of moments when a kind word or a shared meal had been enough to ease the pain of isolation. He talked about the long hours, the quiet sacrifices, and the slow, painful realization that sometimes the system was designed to let people like him fade into the background. "I've seen so many faces come and go," Don said, his voice thick with emotion. "I remember the joy of a first paycheck, the sorrow of losing someone who once believed in change, and every time I kept thinking, maybe one day things will be different." JD's eyes shone with a quiet determination. "I want that day to come," he said. "I want to be more than just a name in the papers. I want to be someone who listens, who learns, and who fights for a future where no one is left behind." The diner, once a silent arena of judgment, now became a crucible for shared dreams. Each table seemed to lean in a little closer, each patron absorbing the raw honesty that filled the room. The conversation between JD and Don was not just a debate, it was a window into the soul of a community that had long felt overlooked, undervalued, and ignored. As the hours wore on, J.D. found himself drifting into recollections of his own past. The diner's warm light blurred into memories of a simpler time, a time when the world was smaller, and every gesture of kindness carried the weight of hope. He remembered sitting on the worn wooden steps of his childhood home, listening to his father speak of honor and integrity. In those moments, every handshake was a promise, every shared meal a silent covenant of community. But as he grew older, the promise of that childhood began to fade under the weight of politics. In a soft, reflective tone, J.D. recalled, "I used to believe that if I could just make it, if I could just prove myself, then I'd be able to change everything. But the harder I tried, the more I realized that change isn't something you force. It's something that grows slowly, nurtured by trust and genuine connection." At the same time, Don's eyes, though still stern, softened as he recalled his own journey. "I remember when this diner was the heart of the community," he murmured, "back when every face was familiar and every meal was shared with pride. But times change, and sometimes you're forced to adapt or get left behind." Their stories intertwined, echoing a shared understanding of what it meant to be both part of a community and an outsider in the eyes of history. As J.D. spoke of dreams and regrets, the room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of the past mingling with the hope for the future. A middle-aged man at a nearby table who had listened quietly until now finally spoke up. "I've worked at the local mill all my life," he said in a husky voice, "and every time I hear promises of change, I remember the nights when I came home to an empty house because nothing ever changed. I'm tired of promises. I'm tired of empty words." J.D. met his gaze. "I understand," he replied softly. "I've seen how empty words can cut deeper than any blade. But I'm here to tell you that I'm not interested in empty words. I'm interested in listening, in learning from your experience. I want to be a part of a conversation that builds something lasting." The man nodded slowly, his eyes betraying a glimmer of hope amid the sorrow. The conversation turned toward the nature of leadership, a leadership that wasn't measured solely by grand gestures or media soundbites, but by the quiet, persistent effort to listen, to learn, and to act with genuine empathy. J.D. recalled the countless times he had been misunderstood by the very people he sought to help. "I've been accused of being out of touch," he said, "of being more interested in the spectacle of politics than the reality of everyday life. But I promise you this, I carry every story, every hardship, every dream shared with me, and I will not forget them." Don leaned forward, his eyes glistening with the hard-earned wisdom of years spent serving others. "Maybe that's what we need," he said. "Not a man who speaks for us from afar, but someone who comes down here, sits with us, listens to our struggles, and then does something real." The conversation meandered through memories and revelations, each story adding another layer to the tapestry of understanding. In that small diner, under the hum of flickering neon, J.D. and Don weren't just two men in conversation. They were symbols of hope in a world battered by disillusionment. As midnight approached, the intensity of the conversation gave way to a more measured, introspective dialogue. Outside, the wind whispered secrets to the trees, and inside, the diner embraced a quiet calm. It was as if the shared vulnerability of the night had softened even the hardest hearts. J.D. paused for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the window where droplets of rain began to form. "There was a time when I thought that anger was the answer," he confessed. "That if I could just get mad enough, the truth would be heard. But tonight, I realize that anger only creates more walls. It's listening that tears down those walls." Don, who had been silent for a while, finally spoke in a tone that was almost wistful. "I never thought I'd see the day when a senator would come in here, not to cause a scene, but to sit down and talk. It's a hard thing, trusting someone who's been painted with so many broad strokes. But maybe Maybe it's time we stop letting their conversation turn toward the possibility of reconciliation, a future where community and leadership were not adversaries, but partners in a shared struggle for dignity and hope. The diner, once a place of quiet rejection, now pulsed with the possibility of transformation. A soft laugh from the counter broke the solemnity. Mary, the ever-watchful waitress, reappeared with a steaming cup of coffee and a reassuring smile. "We make our coffee strong here," she said lightly, and for a moment, even the tension in the room seemed to lighten. J.D. accepted the cup with a grateful nod. "Thank you, Mary," he said, his voice warm. "Sometimes, it's the small things. A good cup of coffee, a kind word, that remind us we're all in this together." The old man in the work jacket, who had been listening with quiet intensity, added, "I've seen a lot in my 35 years at that factory. I've seen people come and go, promises made and broken. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, I feel like maybe things could change." The young man in the booth, his earlier cynicism now replaced by cautious hope, spoke up in a quiet voice. "I always thought you were just another politician, someone who talks and never acts. But listening to you tonight, maybe there's more than that." J.D.'s eyes met the young man's with sincerity. "I'm not here to be perfect," he said. "I'm here to try, and if I fail, I'll learn from my failures. But I promise you this, I will never stop listening." As the clock in the diner ticked steadily onward, the conversation moved beyond politics and into the realm of shared humanity. Each person, in their own way, began to share the burdens they'd carried for so long. Stories of hardship, of moments when hope had been all but extinguished, spilled forth, each tale a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In that moment, the diner became a sanctuary, a place where every whispered story, every quiet confession, was met with understanding rather than judgment. J.D. listened intently, his heart heavy with the realization that the path to genuine change was paved with these individual moments of truth. When the conversation eventually gave way to a brief lull, the sound of sizzling food returned from the kitchen. Plates were cleared, fresh orders called out, and slowly the diner began to reclaim its old rhythm. Yet something fundamental had shifted. What had begun as a standoff of expectations was now evolving into a dialogue, a quiet revolution of hearts and minds. Mary reappeared with a laminated menu in hand. "Here you go," she said softly, placing it before J.D. The simple act of serving food, of treating him like any other customer, carried a significance that words alone could not convey. J.D. picked up the menu, but for a long while he didn't read it. Instead, he watched Don as the latter returned to his station behind the counter. The older man in the work jacket smiled faintly as he resumed his meal, and even the young man in the booth seemed to be reconsidering his earlier judgments. In that moment, the diner wasn't divided by politics or preconceived notions. It was united by the simple act of sharing a meal and a conversation. "Tell me," J.D. said, breaking the comfortable silence. "What can we do next? How do we take this moment, a conversation that has already begun to heal old wounds, and turn it into something that lasts?" Don's eyes, once hardened by years of cynicism, softened as he responded. "We start right here, right now, with honest dialogue, with a willingness to see each other not as enemies or strangers, but as fellow human beings. If we can do that, even if just for one night, then maybe we can start." The words resonated. As the night deepened, the diner transformed into something more than just a place to eat. It became a forum for renewal, a testament to the possibility that understanding could triumph over division. J.D. took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the faces of those gathered. "I promise you," he said firmly, "that I will carry this conversation with me. I will work to ensure that every promise I make is not just empty words, but a commitment to listen, to learn, and to act." Tonight has shown me that change doesn't come from anger or spectacle, but from the quiet power of empathy and understanding. A gentle smile broke across Don's face. A rare, genuine smile that spoke of hope rekindled after a long, hard winter. "I still don't know if I like you," he said with a soft chuckle, "but I can see that you're willing to try." Laughter, tentative at first and then more confident, spread through the room. Even the young man in the booth smiled, a small, honest smile that hinted at the possibility of reconciliation between generations and between different walks of life. The diner, once a microcosm of a divided community, now pulsed with the heartbeat of shared experience. Conversations picked up again, less contentious and more reflective, and slowly, the night grew into a tapestry of voices that, despite their differences, were united by the simple desire to be heard. In the days and weeks that followed, word of that extraordinary evening spread quietly through Springfield. It wasn't splashed across national headlines or sensationalized on talk shows. It was remembered in the hushed tones of neighborhood conversations, in the clink of coffee cups at local diners, and in the soft murmurs of hope that echoed in community halls. J.D. Vance continued his work with the same fierce determination as before, but something in him had shifted. That night at Owen's diner had been a turning point, a moment when he realized that leadership wasn't solely about policies and speeches, but about the human connections forged in the most unassuming places. For Don, the memory of that night lingered as well. A reminder that even in a world defined by division and cynicism, there was room for change if people were willing to simply sit down, listen, and share their stories. In the weeks that followed, the diner became a small beacon of community dialogue. Regulars began to speak openly about their struggles, their hopes, and their dreams for a better future. Old wounds were acknowledged, and new promises were quietly made over steaming cups of coffee. A local newspaper ran a small feature on the transformation at Owen's diner, highlighting the power of conversation in a community that had grown tired of empty promises. The feature quoted several patrons, an older woman who recalled how the diner had once been the heart of the neighborhood, a young man who admitted that he had learned to look beyond his skepticism, and even Mary, whose warm smile now carried the weight of a renewed belief in human decency. In one particularly moving interview, the older man in the work jacket summed it up. "I spent 35 years in a factory, watching as promises were made and broken. But that night, for the first time, I saw a spark of something real. I saw a man who wasn't afraid to listen. To us. And that made all the difference." J.D.'s own reflections were equally poignant. He wrote in his private journal, "Tonight, I was not met with the usual barrage of hostility. Instead, I found a community that was tired of the same old rhetoric, a community that, despite its scars, still believed in the possibility of change. I may be a politician, but tonight, I was simply a man sharing a meal, sharing a story, and sharing a hope that perhaps tomorrow can be." As autumn turned to winter, the conversations that had started in that humble diner continued to grow. Neighbors organized small community meetings, discussions that were held not in grand halls or televised debates, but in the comforting confines of local kitchens and living rooms. The spirit of that night became a quiet revolution, a reminder that sometimes the most radical act is simply to sit down and talk. Months later, when the harsh winds of winter gave way to the gentle promise of spring, Springfield found itself changed in subtle yet profound ways. J.D. Vance, no longer seen solely as a distant politician, began visiting the town more frequently, not just for scheduled appearances, but to genuinely engage with the community. He attended local gatherings, listened to the concerns of factory workers and small business owners, and even participated in neighborhood cleanup drives. His visits were unannounced and unscripted, a far cry from the carefully choreographed tours of the past. At Owen's diner, the legacy of that transformative night was still visible. New photographs were added to the wall, a blend of old memories and fresh faces. The diner's regulars spoke of that night as if it were a turning point in their lives. They recalled the moment when a man of politics had set aside his public persona and simply sat down to listen. And in doing so, he had given them a glimpse of hope, a belief that change was not only possible, but already in motion. One evening, as J.D. sat alone at his usual booth with a cup of Mary's famously strong coffee, an elderly woman approached him. "You know," she said softly, "it's been a long time since someone like you cared enough to listen." "Thank you," J.D. looked at her, his eyes reflecting both regret and determination. "I promise I'll never stop trying," he replied. "Every conversation, every shared meal, it all matters." As word of these genuine interactions spread, even the critics began to soften. The young man who had once scoffed now volunteered at community events. Neighbors who had once turned away in silent judgment now found themselves engaged in discussions about policy, hope, and the future. And through it all, the simple act of conversation became the foundation for a renewed sense of community. Local schools invited J.D. to speak about the importance of empathy and dialogue, and while not every word was met with unanimous approval, the seeds of change had been sown. In classrooms and community centers alike, the legacy of that night at Owen's Diner lived on, an enduring reminder that real change begins with honest communication. J.D.'s journey was far from over. Every day brought new challenges, new criticisms, and new opportunities to prove that he was more than just a headline. In quiet moments, when he was alone with his thoughts, he often reflected on that night and the unexpected transformation it had sparked. "I may never win everyone's trust," he wrote in a private letter to himself, "but if I can reach even one person's heart, then the work is not in vain." As the seasons continued to turn, the memory of that evening became a cornerstone of Springfield's narrative, a story of how a single act of listening could ignite a movement of hope and resilience. It was a story told over dinner tables, at town meetings, and in the quiet moments of reflection shared by those who believed in the possibility of a better tomorrow. As our story comes to a close, we're left with a powerful reminder. In a time when it's all too easy to shout over one another, sometimes the bravest act is to simply sit down, listen, and share our truth. The night at Owen's Diner was not just a fleeting moment of reconciliation. It was a call to every one of us to look past the labels, to challenge our assumptions, and remember that every voice matters. So I ask you, have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between walking away and staying to listen? Have you ever witnessed a moment when, despite all the divisions and disappointments, a simple conversation transformed the way you saw the world? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this dialogue alive. If you found this story worth your time, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because there's always another story to tell, another voice waiting to be heard. Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and above all, keep the conversation going. In the end, the true power of that night wasn't in the headlines or the political battles. It was in the quiet moments of connection, the willingness to embrace vulnerability, and the understanding that change is built not on grand gestures, but on the small, courageous acts of empathy. In the glow of that flickering neon sign, amid the clatter of plates and the soft hum of resumed conversation, a community found its voice. And as J.D. Vance stepped out into the cool Springfield night, he carried with him not just the weight of his responsibilities, but the hope that, together, we can all begin to bridge the divides that separate us. Thank you for joining me on this journey, a journey of rediscovery, of compassion, and of the unyielding power of honest conversation. May this story inspire you to look beyond the surface, to listen with an open heart, and to never underestimate the impact of a single shared moment.